Lynne Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. At our producer's desk is Carly Hollinsby, and Paul Myrie is our sound engineer. Today, our topic is white surprise. White people don't know about racism. This is the second in a series of 7 webinars. During the show, if you'd like to put up a question for our guests, please email Paul Myrie. His email address is myhrep@wabash.edu. That's myhrep@wabash.edu. To combat, reconstruct, and heal from racism, we need to understand the nature of racism. To address the racist dynamics on our faculties and in our student bodies, we need knowledge of the obstacles created by racism. Racism is built to morph, improve, and stay alive. For good-hearted, well-intentioned white people who want to know about the work of justice in the academy, we need to know about the intricacies of why racism is such a death-dealing enterprise. For this conversation today and my guest in 7 out of 7 of these webinars, I'd like to welcome first Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris. Dr. Harris is the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of the Adran College in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, as well as Professor of Religion and Ethics at Texas Christian University. Dean Harris is a well-known facilitator of conversations to heal the wounds of racism and has been part of the leadership of the Wabash community for many, many years. Welcome, Dr. Harris.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Dr. Westfield.
And our conversation partner is Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey. She is Professor of Religion at Drake University, where she also serves as Faculty Director for the Cru Scholars Program. Please see her excellent resources. There are 2 books that she has written. The first, Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in Racially Unjust America, is a New York Times bestseller. Another book and resource that she has created entitled, Dear White Christians, for Those Still Longing for Racial Reconciliation. Welcome, Dr. Jennifer Harvey, to our show.
Thank you, so glad to be here.
So in many ways, this is a continuation of a conversation, and we will continue the conversation for more webinars. We know that the conversation on anti-racism takes time, right? These are important topics that need depth, need trust, need time to breathe even between the conversations. So let's start with one of the dynamics of racism is that those who are the oppressor, white folks will routinely say, I did not know it was that bad. I thought racism had been solved in the 60s. What are you talking about? I don't know I'm surprised that this is going on. So let's start with the basics. Melanie, help us understand, and then we'll go to Jennifer, just from in your own defining words. What is white surprise?
I think actually white surprise is a form of denial. It's an ability to recognize that racism has existed and that one has actually been probably complicit in it, but unwilling to look at that complicit nature of they're just walking around, perhaps in white privilege, but also perhaps in some kind of intentional form. I think in the academy, there's a kind of willful ignorance that we often see in part embedded in the hierarchies of promotion in our processes, particularly tenure and promotion. There is a sense in which to know all is the goal in order to get tenure and to achieve a kind of status. And so when one is white and one recognizes that one's experience publishing, writing, teaching has not been the same experience as scholars of color who may or may not have published, even out-published the white person, then one takes a step back and instead of actually recognizing and taking the moment to think maybe they do not know something, there I think is a trap door of white privilege to say, oh, I just missed it. Don't blame me.
So it's a sidestepping. It's a kind of sidestepping and a use of power, even if you don't acknowledge, even if the person doing it doesn't acknowledge that use of power. So Jennifer, help us understand the why question. Why is surprise a tool of racists? even unwitting racists?
I think it's a tool, and I love the trapdoor language that Dr. Harris just offered, because I think the why has to do with, like, it's a tool that, it enables those of us who are white to just evade accountability and responsibility. And so it's very ideological. I mean, it's like, it's sort of like Robert Jones talks about white people kind of cultivating this this facade of purity, which maintains white innocence. And that's a piece of what white surprise is. It's like, if you tell me about an experience you're having, a racist experience, or a student tells me about something that happened in the classroom, if I respond by saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you, it's sort of like there's some Teflon there that enables you not to be mad at me, right? It sort of like proactively disarms the possibility that I'm responsible for having allowed this climate to continue at my institution. And so whether it's real surprise or not doesn't even matter, because at this point, no white person should be surprised, right? Unless we've chosen not to listen and chosen not to learn. And so it has these multiple layers at which it works to perpetuate racism, because it signals everything from, oh, racism is not a priority to me, or else how could I be surprised, to I'm radically untrustworthy because shock does not suggest to another human being that I'm someone they can rely on, then, right? I've clearly been actively ignoring. And it also like is this like Teflon coating that is really nefarious, because you can't get mad at me because I just didn't know.
And I love the fact that you said you can no longer hide behind not knowing, right? In October of 2020,
yes,
even if you did not know in January of 2020, you have to acknowledge at least a little bit that you know that racism is insidious and pervasive in the academy and in this country.
Yes, yes. It's deeply, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think it's important to name too that even in the midst of DEI commitments, new inclusive excellence commitments within our institutions, actually in response to Black Lives Matters, that the racism is still there. And I think there might be a little bit of a temptation to say, well, we have a new African-American colleague, or we have a new person who's in charge of DEI, so I no longer have to be responsible. And that's a trap.
Melanie, tell us what DEI is. Tell us
diversity.
Some of us don't know what DEI is.
DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's actually an acronym. And in many institutions and college and universities, but also in theological education, there are lots of ways of talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the other forms that Dr. Harvey is knowledgeable of too is inclusive excellence. And that's oftentimes a way of actually bringing to the forefront the conversation and the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a form of excellence that everyone in the institution is actually responsible for. So for the one colleague who's on their way out towards retirement, or the beginning colleague who says, I don't need to actually get involved quite yet, actually inclusive excellence is a model that actually upon arrival in any learning community, your responsibility is to join with others to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So we're starting with the basics. When we can get good-hearted, well-intentioned white people to move away from their surprise. For me, the next step is to say and answer the question, how could there be two realities? How is it possible for Black colleagues to have a different experience of this institution, of these classrooms, than I have as a white person? There is only one reality, right?
Well, can I push back a little bit? Because I actually think there is only one reality. Because I think, Black faculty and scholars know what the reality is, and there's only one of them. What happens is those of us who are white have decided that we're going to ignore the actual reality, which is the one reality, right? So ours is actually a false reality. And it's like, again, inside this ideological, chosen white ideology of purity that isn't even real. Other than to the extent that it's a supremacist kind of, the decision to stay in my lane in this reality, that is an active choice, even if I don't realize that I'm making it. And so I actually, because I just feel clear that scholars of color know both realities, which is to say there is one, and that they're having a particular experience in this one reality, right? And so there's like the sort of parsing off of the entirety of the experience at an institution or in the academy is, it's a supremacist decision that white people make. And I just really, it feels urgent to me to kind of name it that way, especially right now.
Melanie, go ahead.
Well, supremacist decision is a really powerful way of describing it. I appreciate you, Dr. Harvey, for naming it just that way. And I think that if more white colleagues recognize the power that they have, not only in their whiteness, but also in their decision-making power, even as someone who's not an administrator, right? You don't have to be a chair or a dean to be able to bring that kind of supremacist decision-making power to the table. But I think that more awareness around that would be helpful. And there are other ways to become aware of it, right? To actually take a look, for example, at your faculty and ask the question about what are some of the diversity initiatives that our faculty has been engaged in the past 5 years? Have any of them been highly successful? Have they resulted not just in a hire, but literally in the changing of the climate in the faculty? Has there been a reduced level of white surprise? Has there been a reckoning or conversations, multiple conversations about how to create the climate in a way that's actually sustainable and life-giving, where all scholars can actually thrive? That's how you do good religious work. That's how you do good scholarship. That's how you do good teaching in collaboration with each other. But I think that you're right, that there is a deep kind of moment of ritual, moment of prayer, moment of meditation that one has to recognize one's own power in being able to make the decision whether to think in a supremacist mindset or not. Because or not would mean resisting it.
And to think in a supremacist mindset is not one decision that happened a long time ago. It is a decision that happens over and over again, in the moment, in committee meetings, in hiring decisions, in all the aspects of being in classrooms with colleagues, being in classrooms with students. What's at stake for white people if they don't recognize the insidiousness of racism, or what's at stake if they do recognize the insidiousness of racism? Because my contention is part of the reason why people don't do the work is there's a politic of punishment. But let's either one of you, Jennifer or Melanie.
Ooh. Dr. Westfield, would you say more about what's at stake, like the what's at stake part?
So there's got to be, all behavior is goal-oriented, my psychologist father would say.
Okay.
So if white people have chosen, as you say, the way of supremacy, there's got to be payoff for that. The payoff is either you get something for it or you are afraid of the punishment that will come for it. So yeah. We don't have to broach the question in the punishment. I did it from punishment. It might be that there are goodies associated with white supremacy. And as a white person, I'm not willing to give those up, especially in the academy, not except the academy, especially in the academy.
Yeah. So Dr. Patricia Williams has this amazing quote. I think it's from Seeing a Colorblind Future, or maybe that's the book, where she says, cultivating an anti-racist sensibility, and I'm going to mangle the words a little bit, but cultivating an anti-racist sensibility requires cultivating the willingness to spoil a good party. And then she goes on to say, the transgression is dizzyingly intense. It's a reminder of what it means to be alive. And for me, both of those things get right at the question of stakes, because in some ways, of course, choosing to not recognize the reality that's going on at our institutions or in the academy, white people do get payoff for being willing to go along with a good party, right? It comes up in payoff of goods in terms of everything from tenure and promotion to being described as collegial, right? You don't get described as collegial if you are a scholar of color or faculty of color who speaks the truth about what's going on in an institution. And guess what? If you're white and you start naming racist dynamics, the word collegial drops out of the way people describe you as well, right?
So that's what I mean by what's at stake.
Right. So that's at stake.
Mm-hmm.
But the flip side, because you also asked what's at stake for doing it,
Mm-hmm.
I deeply believe, as Patricia Williams said, it's also a dizzyingly intense reminder of what it is to be alive when you start doing it. But most white folks haven't experienced that because most of us don't do it. Or we try it once, and because it doesn't feel like life the first time, we're like, ooh, maybe I'll just pretend I didn't see that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet I know that those stakes are there, that the possibility of joining the other America, as Anne Braden would say it, is also the possibility of coming to know freedom and liberation and life. But again, most white folks we don't even really believe that's true because we haven't experienced it yet.
So Melanie, what we're talking about is inferiority politics, right? People parsing these notions of inferiority and who's in and who's out.
Mm-hmm. And I think that can obviously have almost death-dealing impact on faculty of color particularly. And I think almost an invisible death, right? In the way that we're talking about it here for white faculty. There is a sense in which you can live yourself, and particularly as religious, teachers and scholars of theology. And there's a way in which you can actually cut off your moral compass. You can actually cut off any kind of sensibility that you have in order to channel yourself into the perfect, essentially white male academic, that you really don't have to care for others. You don't have to
white male straight academic.
True. Thank you. You're right. You don't have to do these things. In fact, you can actually be a talking head. I mean, you can become the perfect dead white man who's talked about and whose books are read about generations after your death. That, unfortunately, is the goal. I've been really encouraged by Willie Jennings' work, After Rightness. And in that book, he does a lot of kind of interrogation of theological education, but education as a whole, as to the goal in front of us, usually even from graduate school and probably before, is to become a white male, straight academic. And for the imagination that's required, the creativity that's required for true theological exploration and true understandings of being able to explore theology to the nth degree, it simply does not fit within one identity. It can't fit within one identity. And so we actually make the decision, as we're a part of this project or design of white supremacy in religious and theological education, to cut ourselves off from life.
So we can get past the surprise. We can get past the, we should do something, right? The next step then, what we're lacking, Melanie, and I agree, is the lack of imagination to imagine our academy any way other than this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Jennifer, help us understand the imagination that it would take to correct, to heal, to set policies to do this. Can you imagine a place that would take this courageous step? And what would an institution have to do?
Well, I think that in part, individuals within an institution would need to decide when Dr. Harris used this word imagination, that to me, I thought, okay, a piece of this white surprise and how it shows up in these death-dealing ways in our institutions is that those of us that are white also, long before we got to the academy, it's not like we get to the academy and go, oh, I think I'm going to want to turn into a white straight male now and like shut it all down, right? We've all been inculcated that way since birth, right? And that is a very different journey than many of our colleagues of color have had in their communities and families, right? And so part of what we've got to do if we want to cultivate imagination relative to our institutions is those of us that were in those institutions have to, those of us that are white in particular, need to sort of look around and go, oh, this is not only an institutional problem for me. This isn't going to be fixed with one policy change, though we do need to change policies and do advocacy. I've got to realize prioritizing a commitment to figuring out how my imagination got killed is part of my life work, and that I will then bring that into my institutional spaces. So I think those of us that are in theological education, operating and functioning in institutions, we need to recognize I need to choose proactively and in a sustained, committed way to take this on in a number of levels, right? And so for me, that includes everything from figuring out what happened to me when I was 6. You know, how did I learn these behaviors, this socialization, how was it done to me? And if I'm working on that then sort of shows up alongside the kinds of collaborative relationships I might be able to build in my institution, the kinds of partnerships and advocacy I might find others to generate with me to challenge policies, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just not, I think one of the failures of imagination is to think, oh, if I just get one sort of teaching tool or one sort of advocacy practice down, suddenly I'm going to see it, right? This is a very thick work that has been done to us and that we have also perpetuated. And so it's like recognizing in many spheres of my life, I've got to start sort of digging into what has this system done to my whole formation as a human being? And then how does that show up in my institutional life?
So you're suggesting that teaching is not just a privatized activity in a classroom with students, that you bring your whole self as a teacher, and that any anti-racist work being done by an individual, whether it's an administrator, a teacher, a student, is a project of human flourishing, that the lack of imagination has permeated our minds, our souls, our spirits, our bodies, our relationships, not just our work. So if anti-racism is a human flourishing project, that's a big deal.
Wow.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. I love
it's freedom.
Put it that way.
It's freedom. Say more, Melanie, say more. It is freedom. I believe that.
Yeah,
it is freedom.
It is freedom. And I think it, particularly for scholars who do the work of cultivating the gift and the life of the mind, it is freedom of the mind, not just of the whole self, body, spirit, mind, but really freedom of the mind. I mean, to be able to walk into or imagine walking into a graduate program and really being able to write your dissertation on the ideas that really interest you. You're not your dissertation committee, not your advisor, not the institution, not necessarily that's going to get you the job after you finish, but to really hone in on the ideas that are really interesting and freedom giving for you. And then to think about the you as deeply connected, right? Interconnected with the rest of the planet. Really interconnected, not just with those who have, but those who do not have, those who are in your community and way beyond your community. So it's a different kind of cosmology of thinking about our ideas, but that's freedom, the freedom, psychological freedom, and the freedom to think, to really think as deeply as you can. And that's a gift. It's not a gift always that graduate programs in the beginning give us in theological education. And it's certainly not a gift that the tenure and promotion kind of processes gives us, right? Because immediately there are other voices, whether collegial or not, that evaluate those ideas and critique those ideas to the point of creating or sidelining those ideas and getting us off track. I know for a number of faculty of color who have moved through the tenure process, they remember that upon receiving tenure, they can take a deep breath. Now I can write what I really want to write about, they say. And this is not uncommon. And I think that's a part of the project.
Now I can write what I really want to write because I somehow have made it through this, quote, last door, except I have been stripped of my humanity. I've been stripped of my creativity. I have surrendered my soul to get to this door.
Yeah.
Right. That we have traded our cow for beans and don't realize that there's not enough left to make a contribution now to scholarship.
And as you said, that's not a life of flourishing. That's
That
not
is
a life
not a
of
lie.
flourishing.
That
That's right. And I
that is
think it's only, and it's interesting. I think, you know, when I look back on my own career, I think there were certain points, certainly after tenure, probably the year after tenure, where I recognized how deflated I was, how depressed I was, how negated I felt, how devalued I felt by my colleagues, by my department, by the institution. And I felt like, oh, this is how I'm supposed to feel before a sabbatical. And then when I
no,
got back from sabbatical, I still felt that way. Like I could still see all these, you know, racist frameworks
Yeah.
at work in my institution. I said, wait a minute, this is post-sabbatical. I'm not supposed to see this, but it's there. So there was this kind of recognition that actually the fighting for human flourishing is a resistance. It is a move, an act of resistance. And I've written about this, literally showing up as a womanist scholar in the classroom in the context where I teach is an act of resistance. And I think for many white colleagues, they need to come on board the train of resistance and recognize that every single moment you're in front of a classroom, you're working with a colleague, you're on the phone with a friend, is a moment of transformation, potentially. It is a moment to be able to move in the stream and the river of resistance. And that resistance is for freedom, not just freedom, the civil rights movement, free at last, but it is literally freedom for all of us. And that, I think, is a part of the imagination. That's, in some ways, right, in particular, using kind of Christian language, that's the ideal, that's the kingdom come in some sense. But I'm telling you, if we don't make that kingdom come right now, we're going to be, some of our institutions are going to be in real big trouble because the demographics are changing now and COVID is upon us and the impact of COVID is already upon us. So if we don't move and switch quickly, I think we'll actually lose sight of any glimpse of a life of flourishing that we can have.
So much diversity is being pressed on schools, right? The students in theological schools as well as higher education. And we talk about the available pools of people. Our new immigrant populations are, I'm going to say brown bodies. We talked 20 years ago about the browning of America. We're no longer waiting for the browning of America. America has browned. So now that these brown bodies are entering these classrooms, both as students and as faculty, we no longer have the luxury of deciding, will we be about diversity? The brown bodies are here, but we can also do a great disservice and dehumanization to our brothers and sisters if we do not reconcile with racism and the depth of racism that we participate in as an academy.
Can I name something that feels like it's percolating here too about flourishing, and that has to do with relationships, and it's which does also relate to this reality of the diversity that's here in terms of our student populations, and of course in terms of, it bears on the question of capacity around inclusive pedagogies and that kind of thing. But it's deeper than that, and that is that, you know, Dr. Harris, as you were talking about your experience of tenure and then sabbatical, what strikes me, and as you shared that, was just sort of the echoes of being isolated that it sounded like I was hearing. And I don't say that to put words in your mouth, but that I was sort of hearing that and thinking about, for those of us that are white, this sort of coming to awareness or decision around what it means to acknowledge that that we have no imagination, or that it's been malformed out of us, can be a really lonely, isolated place. And I remember, you know, in my own journey for, you know, most of my 20s and part of my 30s, maybe even perhaps, just feeling like, oh my God, I'm going to die in here by myself as I face this beast of white supremacy, and it's cutting me off from relationships, right? But I don't know if I can ever actually have relationships. And as I've journeyed further, one of the things I feel clear about is the way that relationality can emerge when we choose to give up this sort of false innocence, false sense of surprise, and do the work, and sort of we become sort of positioned to maybe be in relationship. And this image, Dr. Westfield, you offered us a few webinars ago about how many times at the academy, for example, you know, womanist scholars might be standing in the hallway having a really good time with one another, and white folks will sometimes sort of step in and police that, say, oh, you're just, you know, right? But that kind of dynamic happens with queer people in the academy too, because in fact, we are having a really good time sometimes with one another in relationship. And so I think there's also this possibility of flourishing that comes up as, and I want to just sort of name that for white folks on the call in particular around, I feel like sometimes it's like being willing to walk to the tomb, thinking there might be a body there and face what white supremacy has wrought in our lives. And that is a hard journey. But sometimes, if I can get a little Baptist on us, sometimes we get there and find out, if we're willing to go to the tomb, there's been a resurrection, and that like this freedom that Dr. Harris is talking about has come. And that's part of what I think, like, I just want to constantly keep offering. It's not an easy journey. I'm not sort of down, you know, sort of saying, oh, it's sugarcoating, like, oh, just make friends. That's not what I'm talking about. But there is flourishing on the other side of death if we choose to take the journey. And I just sort of, you know, I just really feel clear about that.
There is flourishing on the other side of death. There is. We know how to have life. We know how, and like you said, it's not shallow, it's not easy, but it's worth the journey, right? It is worth the journey. To our listeners and to our viewers, if you want to ask our panel a question, please email Paul Myhrep at myhrep@wabash.edu. So most people I don't think ascribe to, I just need to set one policy. We just need to do one thing. And if that's what they think, then we're dissuading them of that right now. It sounds like we need groups of people, we need collaborations. You can't make these changes in isolation. And the academy is an isolated place. This is what you both were talking about, a privatized place and an isolated place. It sounds like we also need a pep talk and permission to talk and be in collaboration with each other about this important issue and moving in these visionary directions to save our own souls. How do you get faculty? What does it mean to give faculty permission to collaborate and talk about taboo issues?
Well, one way I know that we've seen really effective is actually just to get faculty together to talk about their teaching within one particular institutional context. So there's a sense in which all of the faculty have a sense of the student body, for example. I know at our institution, we have a number of first-year students, and those first-year students are often encouraged to take their mandated religion class. What I wished would have happened earlier was more opportunity during faculty meetings for faculty to talk about their teaching and their experiences of teaching. Because of the rapid pace of the academic year, this was often sidebarred, it was often put to the end, or it was done in a way that was a workshop on teaching, like how to do better pedagogy together. But it actually, I think we ended up missing the opportunity to really connect with each other collaboratively, to ask not just questions about assignments, but literally, what is your body experiencing different than mine? And why is that difference? And I think that probably would have opened a space for there to be more talk. So literally, I think the suggestion would be to get the faculty to really hone in about their own bodily experiences of teaching in their learning context. And again, it's not a conversation about teaching evaluations necessarily. It's not a conversation necessarily about how to shift the policy, but it's really a question about teaching. And how do you bring your fullest self? How do you bring your teaching self? One of the most exciting assignments that I did as a part of a Wabash pre-tenure group led by Dr. Carolyn Medine was to draw a picture, a metaphor of myself as a teacher. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing in this Wabash workshop to see all the different images and all the different metaphors of how we saw ourselves as teachers. I am a fourth generation teacher in my family. And so my family of teachers began with my great-grandmother, and she taught in a very segregated space in Mississippi. My grandmother then taught in a segregated space also in Mississippi, but a schoolhouse essentially, where all of her children, as well as the children of the community, all were under her leadership and all under her teaching. My mother is an educator, and then to see myself as an educator. So when I got my teaching evaluations back, that remarked about the fact that they didn't really trust my teaching. They didn't really trust my knowledge. They really weren't sure about whether or not, as a woman of color, I had the authority I should have in the classroom. Before coming up with that metaphor, I myself began to doubt my own expertise in teaching. And I think in that particular space of doubt is where a lot of the critique from my white colleagues came in and just took a deep, deep bite. And that's where my confidence began to shake. And then to be a part of those conversations in terms of teaching evaluations over the next several years. And it began to not just feel like a bite into my confidence and into my identity, but a bite into my reality and my identity and my mother's life as a teacher, my grandmother's life as a teacher, my great grandma. And that's a pattern. That's called systemic racism.
That's systemic racism. The question of who is the self who teaches has got to include race, has got to include gender, has got to include sexual orientation, has got to include all those social indicators and social locators that create pressure and shape us and who we are. We just can't say those things aren't important when I think of who I am when I'm in the classroom, right? Those things have to be brought to bear. And then the politics that's included in all those social locators and the social stratas in this country have also got to be taken in consideration, because they are active and alive in how we understand ourselves, how our students see us, and how we are able to move forward or not. Jen, come on into this conversation. How do we help people include identities of race in their understanding of who they are as a teacher? If they're a white person who wants to say, I'm not white, I'm just normal.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of how we do it, and it depends on where we're located in institutions, but, if we're on faculty, and if our own, depending on what our own racial identity is, right, that we need to just decide, this is not optional, I've got to look around and see who here on this faculty, whether it's a faculty of 15, and so there's only one other person or maybe two, or a faculty of 100 and maybe there's 10 folks who would convene with me so we could just initiate a conversation, even if we don't know the answers to the conversation. And I remember times at my institution where groups of us would say, we don't even know what we need to get clear about, but we're just going to meet every week for an hour over lunch on a Friday because there's some stuff that is urgent. And as we did that, some of our clarity around the urgency for collaboration around justice issues and sort of healing and trust building and relationship building that was needed around different forms of identity and how it impacted our institutional experience, that started to develop. But it's we have to, and this gets right back to the white surprise thing, we have to recognize it's a choice that we have to make and seek out and many, many times create for ourselves. Now, if we're a dean, right? Thankfully we do have some fantastic deans, including on this call. We have more institutional sort of power and leadership that we can convene such spaces. But faculty who don't have deans like that shouldn't wait for that to just magically happen. It's not going to happen. We have to find others who we can say, hey, can we just sort of try to take a journey around this and make it a commitment as much as we make a commitment to grading papers. I mean, it's just as important. And new things will grow if we make that a discipline, a part of how we think about what our work is in our vocation as teachers.
So you can't say the racial identities of my students don't matter. I teach everybody the same.
No way.
That is the poorest of pedagogies. You can't say, I don't need to get to know my students because it doesn't matter who's in the room. I teach the content of my discipline. That's the poorest of pedagogies, right? You can't say identity politics doesn't matter in the classroom. It matters. It affects learning. It affects teaching. It affects how we are together in the larger society. So what I hear both of you saying is being intentional about teaching, being intentional about your students and being in relationship has to take into consideration these notions of race and racism.
And I think that's important, not just for white faculty, obviously, but also for faculty of color, particularly those of us who have been shaped in such a way whereby a self-protective measure in the classroom is to really focus in on the content and to almost invisibilize our own bodies and how we perceive ourselves, as well as to ignore how the students may be perceiving us, to say, well, we're just about the content, and trying to use that to kind of prove to the colleagues, to prove to the institution, I'm a real ethicist, so to speak, or I'm a true theologian because these are the thinkers that I'm articulating. So it's a reminder for scholars of color again to also recognize race, our own race, but also racialized beings in our classroom and the racial dynamic. Just because you're a person of color doesn't excuse you from being a self-reflective teacher. And just because racism is happening in the institution, which you may have experienced yourself, doesn't mean that you can actually get off of the block of teaching and off of the project of flourishing in the classroom. This is a part of your life too. And I find that because of fatigue, oftentimes because the racism is so weighty, many of us are burnt out, sick and tired of being sick and tired, particularly trying to educate white colleagues who do not want to understand, nor are they interested in changing. One can get to a point where you get so frustrated where you're just like, you know what? I'm going to teach my content. They need to know these particular thinkers by the time they get out of the class. If there's a racial incident that happens in the middle of the classroom, too bad. I'm going to keep on teaching. And I think particularly as faculty of color, we actually can create more harm, particularly to our racialized students in the classroom when we ignore incidents because we're tired.
Well, and white surprise is one of the most tiring things, right? Just one of the most tiring things. Dr. Myrie, any questions from our listeners and from our viewers?
Thank you for asking. There are a number of questions. Here's one that tended to bring together a number of the questions into a couple of questions. So could the panelists talk more about the increase in anti-racism diversity training sessions in institutions for Board of Trustees, administration, teachers, students, or staff, and how organizations can move beyond awareness and general discussions to actions at a higher level? That's the first question. Second question related to that, do the panelists have stories or could they share observations or lessons learned on how not, all caps, to approach anti-racism collectively and individually from a leadership point of view?
Well, let's take the second question first. So I'll go first and we can go to Melanie and then Jennifer. These conversations are difficult to move them past the shallow level. And years ago, many years ago, my mother said one of the best ways to have a difficult conversation is everybody be on their best behavior. So it's when you get lax, it's when you start to say, well, I know who you are and what you are about, so I will take this, I'll take this privilege in saying whatever I want to say. That these kind of conversations, until trust is built, until a vocabulary is built, until a certain amount of camaraderie is built around these difficult things, need people to be, I'm going to use the word formal and not so casual, right? That to build an ethic of respect, an ethic of listening, rather than kind of the cultural bull in the cultural china shop, where you don't know much of anything, but you think you can laugh and joke and so my mother's foil for that, which has worked for me over the years, is to be on your best behavior, right? to actually use titles, wait for people to finish sentences, be about a more formal structure, and wait for permission to ask certain kinds of questions. That would be my response to the question about how do you approach this? What are stories and techniques of how to approach this and get to some of the deeper levels? But Melanie and then Jen.
Yeah, Dr. Westfield, that's such a gift. Thank you for sharing that from your mom, because I think that that certainly is an area that I remember experiencing, and it actually was a signal to me about where the racial consciousness was in my collegial group, in my department. That was, I asked my colleagues, particularly my white male colleagues, to call me Dr. Harris and to call me by my formal name, because it signaled then to the students that this is a person who holds just as much authority in our department as anybody else. Many of them refused, and not only refused, but actually made quite light and joking about the fact that they, in their understanding, had some kind of complex, that I was superior to them, that I was arrogant. Now, anybody who knows me knows that I'm actually not quite an arrogant person. So, but I had to contend with that perception then of them, of me, and then also reckon with the fact that they were unwilling to side with me as allies to try to create a teaching context whereby we were all considered the same. We all had PhDs, we were all teaching. That signaled then to me that they were unable to move beyond that. So I would say that the formal is actually really helpful, in part because it begins to change the atmosphere and to at least a climate of equality, that actually all of the faculty can agree that we all are the same, and that for the sake of the students, if not for the sake of themselves, we are trying to create a space of flourishing and living and learning and understanding together, so that at least the students are shaped in an anti-racist way. In my situation, and I think in a lot of situations, the exact opposite is the case. There is actually intentionality of creating a racial hierarchy. There's an intentionality. I had colleagues tell students to take my class because it engaged race. And then when they show up in graduate school and they have no idea what critical race theory, there's a whole nother discourse, right, that comes from faculty who are like, how did you get these students through? They have no idea how to engage conversation about religion. And I think that those are some of the disadvantages that our faculties do to ourselves. We're actually ill-equipping our students from moving forward and moving the race conversation forward.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Absolutely. Jen.
One of the mistakes that I've seen often, and I think actually Dr. Harris and I have seen as we've consulted with institutions over the years, is that a lot of times well-intentioned white leadership will, including faculty sometimes, will, in an attempt to sort of maybe get through white surprise, really ask and invite, especially students. I see this done to students all the time, to have listening sessions where students of color can tell us what they've experienced. And there's a way in which this is complicated, because of course we need to create venues where students' actual experiences get named and addressed and redressed. But what happens, I think, in institutions, which I see all the time, is that becomes the action. And so white institutions will do, oh, we're gonna do listening sessions. Oh, we're gonna do listening sessions. Oh, and look at, and it sort of feeds this cul-de-sac kind of phenomena that of course ends up, it's incredibly exhausting and dangerous actually for students and colleagues then, if it happens with colleagues, right? And also it becomes this substitute for the sort of journey and work itself of actually then moving into anti-racist commitment. So for example, I think institutions, or when we have venues where we're trying to figure out what's going on in our racial climates, should never come without some sort of clear commitment up front about, and so then whatever the action steps are, here's going to be the budget for it. Here's going to be who's responsible for it. Here's going to be, so that there is a commitment around action that comes anytime there is an ask around, what are you experiencing here? Because the kind of violence that it does to hear what folks are experiencing and then do nothing with it, except in 2 years ask again,
That's right.
is it's violent to do that. And that happens a lot.
So Dr. Harvey, that leads us to the first question that the viewer posed about the uptick in the number of anti-bias or bias training that's being done with trustees and faculties, rarely students, but at least with trustees and faculties. That my experience, so I'm glad those training sessions are happening. The challenge of them, Dr. Harvey, is just what Dr. Harvey mentioned. You tick it off, you check it off the list and then go back to business as usual. They don't gain any traction. There's no change in climate. There's no change in policy. There's no change in attitude. There's no change in behavior. It was just another workshop that got ticked off the box. People did not develop a shared vocabulary. They did not problematize anything in the institution. They just survived the workshop
Yes.
on bias.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that question around consultants and workshops and all that is a really urgent one, because on the one hand, there's need for some real capacity building, measurable, transformative kinds of work, and there are organizations that do that work for the long haul with institutions. Mm-hmm. There's also a tendency, and there's lots of these out there too, I see this sort of in my own institution and other places I sometimes go, that there's this very consumptive model. It's like, oh, I'm going to get some content. And again, that's the work, as opposed to transformed consciousness is a piece of enabling a different kind of work. And so for me, it's just dicey, because we have to have, book reads and all these kind of sort of ongoing sustained consciousness transformation pieces, these pieces happening, but they are not a substitute for transformation. And so I think for me, there's always a piece around organizing and activism in any of this, because it's always going to take folks who are in the institution saying, I'm going to hold people's feet to the fire. Like, I can do it with love, or I can do it with not love too. But however I do it, there's got to be a willingness to be organized and hold people's feet to the fire, because otherwise it's just a passive consumption of new knowledge that maybe I don't like, or maybe I love, but either way, nobody's life becomes one of flourishing because the conditions don't change.
So, Lynne Harris, you do a lot of consulting. What kind of, not all consultants are the same. Give us some tips on how to choose a good consultant for a particular context on these difficult issues.
It's a great question. It's a great question. One wants to do an inventory of one's own institution, and that can be kind of a basic inventory in terms of how you see teaching, how you see research, how you see service, how you see activists and activist scholars, how those are kind of ranked and perceived. But then also one can do a DEI, a diversity, equity, and inclusion inventory, so to speak. How many courses do you have that reach into the conversation about race, systemic racism, institutional racism? Where are students actually being educated in these particular areas? Do you have a faculty of color and white faculty teaching into race? What do the courses look like? How is the curriculum shaped? Is there a sense in which all of the students actually have to wait until they matriculate to their last year to take a class on race or that engages racism? And then there are obviously a lot of different inventories in terms of the professors that you actually have, faculty and staff who are actually embodied representations of racial difference and racial identity. What are their experiences? Inventory in a number of different ways. I think once you have a snapshot of the DEI inventory of who you are as a unit, as a department, as an institution, then actually look for consultants who can help you to articulate a diversity strategic plan based on that inventory. If you know you have no one to teach classes in race and racism with the kind of expertise that you need, then one approach is to take a step back and say, how do we find the funding to encourage faculty to do a course development and to receive the training? But then also, how do we start thinking about hiring someone who actually can bring that expertise in? Because without that expertise, it's clear that you're not actually giving the best education to your students. Finding the right consultant then can actually be done by doing that inventory. And there are consultants who one-on-one, for example, if one finds that there are a lot of different personnel issues in race, around race, or racial issues or racial discrimination, there are particular consultants that you may want to bring in that actually focus less on institutional and more on personnel. How do we actually build interpersonal dynamics and work with power dynamics in a particular faculty? I know that for us, we were actually able to reach out to the Wabash Center very early on in my career. I experienced it as a scholar of color who was pre-tenure, and that was edifying for me. I think, unfortunately, I didn't experience it exactly in the same positive way, but we actually had Wabash consultants come and sit with our department and ask some basic questions about vision, mission, strategic plan, student engagement, and basic questions. And because our institution
Institutional pillars, right? This conversation isn't extra to the institution.
That's
It
right.
has to be, it is the institution. I interrupted
That's
you.
right.
Keep going.
No,
But
I think some of these basic questions, actually what faculty is, many faculty don't have a 5-year plan. We're just trying to get through the year.
so when I was a Wabash consultant, the first question I would ask in going into a context was, what do you want to become? Right? You have problematized something. What do you want to become? No school could ever answer that question. No school had thought before the consultant shows up, what do we want to become? Mostly something was blowing up or burning down, or there was some pressure point, some conflict, something had gone awry, which is not the wrong place to start. Let us start with that. But somebody has to do the work of visioning where are we trying to get to? Right? Are we trying to be friendly? Are we trying to be a family? Are we trying to be neighborly? What are we trying to do other than just saying we want the people of color to stop being mad at us? You know, we want the students to stop. And the work of visioning is the work of creativity and imagination. And it's not that lacks politics, but it is the work of creativity and imagination.
Yes. And I think when you're inclusive, and using an anti-racist frame, one can actually create, even in that moment, a real deep sense of belonging, particularly for faculty of color, an investment from them into who you are as a white leader, as a white person of power and privilege in that space. Because one of the things I so appreciate about Dr. Harvey and our connection and relationship, and many of the white allies that I'm close to, they recognize that as white people, they have to earn trust every day. A faculty person of color goes into the academy knowing that they cannot trust every white person. And so as a white person, one ought not be surprised when trust becomes an issue, because we live in a white supremacist context and society. So you have to do more than invite somebody to lunch.
Dr. Harvey.
Oh, I'm just going to say amen to that. It's just that there's no more words I need to add, but yes, you have to do more than invite somebody to lunch.
To our listeners, the next Harvey and Harris webinar on racism will be November 18th from 4 to 5 Eastern Time. And we intentionally left that a non-themed yet conversation. We wanted to see in the country where we were, we wanted to see in our own conversation and the kinds of questions we received, what topics people needed to hear about. So if there are specific topics that you would like us to consider for the 2 open spaces in this series of conversations with Harris and Harvey, please email Paul Myrie and suggest topics that you want a more in-depth look at. The Wabash Center website will have this video as well as all the videos of our webinars available to you. We would suggest that our viewers and listeners consider using these conversations in your faculty meetings and in your classroom. So rather than interpreting them, take them as resources into your faculty meetings to springboard, to spark conversations about the kinds of topics that we're talking about. There are also other resources on our website, including blogs and vlogs and articles that can be used for this anti-racist work. I want to thank Carly and Paul, without them, this work would not be possible. And to Melanie and Jennifer, thank you so much. Do either one of you or both of you have one last word? This feels like a particularly generative conversation today, so thank you. And for the people who are listening, a word of encouragement. This work is hard.
I believe we can know flourishing. I really do. Flourishing is the word I want to leave you with.
It is possible. It really is possible. Freedom is possible.
Thank you so much. And we're out. What a terrific conversation.
Oh, thank you. Wow.
Thanks.
Sacred.
Yay, yay, yay.